Captain Jake Morrison stared at the sensor readings on his command screen and felt his blood turn cold. The numbers made no sense at first, then made terrible sense all at once. 3 million ships were moving through hyperspace toward human territory, and they were not human ships. The USS Valiant trembled slightly as its engines worked to maintain position at the edge of the Sirius system, where long-range sensors could pick up the approaching fleet without being detected themselves. Lieutenant Amy Carter looked up from her station with wide eyes and spoke in a voice that barely stayed steady. The enemy fleet was massive beyond anything they had ever seen, stretching across light years of space like a dark cloud that swallowed stars. Each ship in the alien armada was organic, grown rather than built, with hulls that pulsed like living tissue and weapons that looked more like organs than cannons. The Vorthak Collective had finally come for humanity, just as the rumors had warned they would. Morrison hit the communications button and opened a channel to Luna Station, where Admiral Peter Blake commanded the entire Terran Defense Force. The message would take hours to reach him through hyperspace relay stations, but every minute counted now. Morrison spoke clearly into the microphone as he transmitted the sensor data along with his report. 40,000 human ships against 3 million alien vessels was not a battle. It was a massacre waiting to happen. Dr. Lisa Hayes was working late in her laboratory aboard the research station Olympus when the alert came through. She had been studying Vorthak specimens captured from previous encounters, trying to understand how their biology worked and how they might be stopped. The aliens were unlike anything else in the galaxy, operating as a single massive mind spread across billions of individual bodies. Each Vorthak warrior was smart and deadly, but they all thought the same thoughts and made the same decisions because they were all part of one consciousness. The laboratory was quiet except for the hum of machinery and the soft bubbling of specimen tanks. Hayes moved between her workstations, checking readings and making notes about Vorthak tissue samples. Their cellular structure was fascinating and horrifying at the same time, designed for rapid adaptation and perfect coordination. But as she studied the data, she began to see something that might be important. The Vorthak were predictable precisely because they were perfect, following mathematical patterns that never changed because their hive mind could not conceive of acting irrationally. Admiral Blake received Morrison's message while reviewing defense plans in his office overlooking Earth's moon. The holographic displays around his desk showed the positions of every human military vessel, from massive battleships to tiny patrol craft. 40,000 ships sounded impressive until you compared them to 3 million. And Blake had been a military officer long enough to know that numbers usually decided the outcome of battles, but he also knew that humans had survived worse odds before, though never on this scale. The evacuation orders went out within hours of Blake's decision, transmitted to every human colony and outpost in the threatened sectors. Most people began packing immediately, loading their belongings onto transport ships and fleeing toward the inner systems where the main human fleet waited. But not everyone chose to run. On the farming world of New Dakota, settlers looked at their fields of grain and decided they would rather fight than abandon everything they had built. The miners on Titan's Edge sent back a message that consisted of just 2 words: "Come ahead." Morrison watched the evacuation ships launch from his position on the edge of the system and felt both proud and worried about his species. Humans had always been stubborn, refusing to give up even when logic said they should. It was a trait that had carried them from one small planet to dozens of worlds across the galaxy, but now it might get them all killed. The Vorthak had consumed 17 star systems already, leaving nothing behind but empty space where planets used to orbit dead stars. The alien fleet moved closer every hour, their bioships sliding through hyperspace with organic efficiency. Intelligence reports from other sectors painted a grim picture of Vorthak tactics. They did not just conquer worlds, they consumed them completely, breaking down matter at the molecular level to fuel their endless expansion. Every ship, every building, every living thing became raw material for growing more Vorthak warriors and vessels. Hayes made a discovery that sent her running to the communications center. While studying brain tissue from captured Vorthak specimens, she had noticed something strange about their neural pathways. The aliens were incapable of truly random thought, because every decision had to be approved by the collective consciousness. This made them incredibly coordinated, but also meant they could not understand or predict truly chaotic behavior. She immediately sent her findings to Admiral Blake with a note that this might be humanity's only advantage. Blake read Hayes's report 3 times before calling his senior staff to an emergency meeting. The idea seemed insane, but insane ideas had worked for humans before. If the Vorthak could not understand random or irrational behavior, then the key to fighting them might be abandoning traditional military doctrine entirely. Instead of trying to outthink an enemy with perfect coordination, humanity might need to embrace chaos and unpredictability. Morrison received new orders that made him smile despite the approaching danger. Instead of retreating to join the main fleet, the Valiant was to remain in position and observe the enemy advance, gathering intelligence about their formations and movement patterns. But he was also authorized to take any action he deemed necessary, regardless of how unconventional it might be. For the first time since detecting the alien fleet, Morrison felt a spark of hope. The first Vorthak scouts emerged from hyperspace just outside the orbit of Pluto, their organic hulls gleaming in the light of distant stars. They moved in perfect formation, every ship exactly where it should be according to some vast mathematical plan. Morrison watched them on his sensors and realized that Hayes had been right about their predictability. The aliens were following patterns so precise that a computer could calculate their next move hours in advance. But humans were not computers, and Morrison was about to prove it. He ordered his ship to move into an attack position that made no tactical sense, approaching the enemy scouts from an angle that exposed the Valiant to maximum danger while providing no apparent advantage. His crew followed orders without question, trusting their captain even when they did not understand his strategy. The Vorthak scouts paused in their advance, their collective mind trying to process the illogical human behavior. In that moment of hesitation, Morrison struck with every weapon his ship carried, destroying 2 alien vessels before disappearing back into the asteroid field, where sensors could not track him. It was a small victory against impossible odds, but it proved that humans could surprise an enemy that thought it knew everything about warfare. The war for humanity's survival had begun. Commander Ryan Torres felt his ship shake as alien weapons tore through the hull of the Thunderhawk, like it was made of paper instead of military-grade armor. The Vorthak bioships moved through space with fluid grace, their living hulls pulsing with each deadly shot they fired at the human fleet. Lieutenant Kate Williams shouted damage reports from her station while emergency lights bathed the bridge in red warning colors that made everything look like a scene from hell. The enemy weapons were unlike anything Torres had ever seen in 20 years of military service. Energy beams passed straight through their defensive shields as if the barriers did not exist at all, striking the hull with acid-like effects that dissolved metal and ceramic composites in seconds. Williams called out shield readings that made no sense, because the numbers showed their defenses were still functioning perfectly even as the ship took massive damage. Torres watched the tactical display and began to see patterns in the alien attack formations. Every Vorthak ship moved in perfect coordination with every other ship, maintaining exact distances and firing at precisely calculated intervals. Their movements were so mathematically precise that a computer could predict their next action hours in advance, which gave Torres an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. He began issuing orders that made his bridge crew look at him with concern and confusion. The Thunderhawk turned toward the enemy fleet instead of away from it, exposing their damaged hull to even more firepower, while apparently gaining no tactical advantage. Williams questioned the order but followed it anyway, trusting her commander even when his strategy seemed like suicide. The Vorthak formation wavered for just a moment as their collective consciousness tried to process the illogical human behavior. In that brief hesitation, Torres struck with everything his ship had, concentrating fire on the lead bioship and watching with satisfaction as it exploded in a burst of organic matter and energy. The other alien vessels paused again, their hive mind struggling to understand why humans would choose tactics that increased their own danger. Colonel Nick Johnson hit the ground, running as Vorthak landing pods crashed through the atmosphere of Haven Prime like deadly meteors. The agricultural world had 10,000 civilians who had refused evacuation orders, believing they could defend their farms and homes with hunting rifles and determination. Johnson commanded only 300 Marines, but those soldiers would have to be enough to protect everyone until transport ships could arrive. Sergeant Maria Santos was already moving through the farming communities, organizing evacuations and setting up defensive positions in grain silos and equipment barns. The civilians were scared but determined, many of them veterans from previous conflicts who knew how to handle weapons even if they had never fought aliens before. Santos tried to maintain optimism while privately calculating how long they could hold out against an enemy that had conquered 17 star systems. The first Vorthak warriors emerged from their crashed landing pods like nightmares given physical form. They stood 8 feet tall with 4 arms ending in razor-sharp claws, their heads dominated by compound eyes that could see in multiple spectrums simultaneously. Each alien warrior moved with perfect coordination, knowing exactly where every other warrior would be at any given moment because they all shared the same collective consciousness. Johnson's Marines opened fire with conventional weapons but quickly discovered that standard military tactics were worse than useless against an enemy that could predict every move. The Vorthak adapted to each attack within seconds, their collective mind analyzing human weapons and developing countermeasures faster than individual soldiers could change strategies. What should have been an even fight became a slaughter as the aliens advanced through defensive positions, like they were not there, private. Danny Clark was helping evacuate a farming complex when inspiration struck him like a lightning bolt. The building was filled with agricultural equipment including large tanks of liquid fertilizer connected to an automated irrigation system. Clark had grown up on a farm and knew that certain fertilizers could be turned into powerful explosives. With the right chemical modifications and timing mechanisms, Santos watched Clark work on his improvised bomb and realized what he was planning to do. It was completely insane and violated every safety regulation in the military handbook, but conventional approaches were failing against an enemy that could predict rational behavior. She helped him connect pipes and set timers while Johnson's surviving Marines fell back toward the agricultural complex, under heavy alien fire. The Vorthak warriors advanced through the cornfields in perfect formation, their collective consciousness calculating the optimal approach to eliminate remaining human resistance. They had analyzed every conventional weapon and tactic the humans possessed, developing countermeasures that made victory mathematically certain. What they could not predict was that humans would use farming equipment as military weapons. Clark triggered his device just as the leading alien warriors reached the complex, turning 3 tons of agricultural machinery and fertilizer into the galaxy's most unlikely explosive device. The blast caught the Vorthak completely off guard, because their collective mind had no framework for understanding why humans would turn peaceful farming tools into weapons of war. Several warriors were destroyed instantly, while others stood frozen as their hive mind tried to process the impossible. Chief Engineer Greg Parker was working around the clock in the manufacturing facilities of New Pittsburgh when reports arrived about Clark's improvised explosive success on Haven Prime. The idea of using unconventional materials as weapons inspired Parker to think about other ways to surprise an enemy that seemed to know everything about human military technology and tactics. Working with metallurgist Dr. Carol Brown, Parker began developing ammunition that would change its properties randomly during flight, making it impossible for the Vorthak collective consciousness to calculate defensive responses. The concept violated everything they knew about physics and engineering. But conventional weapons were proving useless anyway, so they had nothing to lose by trying something impossible. Brown helped design bullets that could shift between different densities and compositions while traveling toward their targets, creating projectiles that behaved differently every time they were fired. They called their creation chaos rounds and began mass production immediately, knowing that strange times called for strange solutions to impossible problems. The Vorthak Queen Mind began broadcasting messages through captured human prisoners, her voice cold and mathematical as it explained why resistance was pointless. Human defeat was statistically inevitable, given the vast difference in numbers and technology between the two species. She offered terms that sounded reasonable until you realized they involved the complete absorption of humanity into the collective consciousness, erasing individual thoughts and personalities forever. Morrison, now commanding a growing fleet of resistance vessels that included everything from military ships to converted civilian craft, responded to the Queen Mind's ultimatum with words that became a rallying cry throughout human space. Standing on his bridge, surrounded by officers from dozens of different ships, he delivered a message that carried hope to every human settlement. Logic isn't our strongest suit anyway. The response spread across the galaxy like wildfire, inspiring humans everywhere to embrace the very qualities that made them different from the Vorthak. Chaos and unpredictability became weapons more powerful than any technology, as people learned to fight an enemy that could predict rational behavior but had no defense against creative insanity. Admiral Blake stood in his command center staring at tactical displays that showed the impossible becoming reality across human space. Small victories were adding up to something bigger, something that military science said should not be happening against an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. The Vorthak advance had slowed and in some sectors actually stopped as their collective consciousness struggled to process human behavior that made no logical sense. Operation Wildcard was Blake's response to the changing situation, a strategy that abandoned every principle of military doctrine in favor of pure creative chaos. He promoted officers who had succeeded through unconventional methods, giving command positions to people who thought like artists instead of soldiers. Captain Julia Davis received orders to take command of the strangest fleet ever assembled, a collection of civilian vessels converted into warships through pure improvisation. Davis accepted her new assignment with enthusiasm that worried her staff officers but inspired her crews. Her flagship was the Starlight Express, a luxury cruise liner whose ballrooms now housed torpedo launchers and whose swimming pools had been drained to make room for fighter craft. The ship's 5-star restaurant served military rations while former entertainment. Directors coordinated bombing runs against alien positions. General Steve Miller prepared the fortress world of Ironhold for siege, knowing that conventional defenses would fail against an enemy that could predict every rational military response. His aide Captain Lucy Foster worked with local civilians to create a defense network that violated every principle of military engineering while somehow making perfect sense to people who had learned to think creatively about survival. Teachers designed trap systems based on classroom management techniques, using the same psychology that controlled unruly children to funnel alien warriors into kill zones. They understood that behavior control was about creating expectations and then subverting them, skills that translated surprisingly well to military tactics against an enemy that relied on predictable responses. Artists throughout the planet created camouflage patterns that confused Vorthak sensors by using designs that made no mathematical sense but worked perfectly in practice. Their approach was based on emotional impact rather than scientific principle, creating visual effects that the alien collective consciousness could not analyze or understand because they operated on subconscious levels of perception. Children contributed ideas that adult military planners had never considered, suggesting hiding places in air vents and maintenance tunnels that turned entire cities into three-dimensional mazes. Their natural tendency to see possibilities that adults overlooked became a strategic advantage, as the planet prepared to face an enemy that thought it understood how civilized beings organized their defenses. Dr. Hayes made her most important discovery while studying brain tissue samples from captured Vorthak specimens in her laboratory aboard Olympus Station. The alien collective consciousness experienced something very similar to computer system crashes when exposed to truly random events, causing temporary paralysis in nearby warrior units, while their hive mind attempted to reboot itself and process the impossible. Working with quantum physicist Dr. Matt Turner and chaos mathematician Professor Helen Lee, Hayes developed what they called the entropy protocol. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of trying to defeat the Vorthak through superior firepower or tactics, humanity would weaponize its own unpredictability on a massive scale, turning every human action into a source of chaos. Commander Torres led a volunteer squadron on what everyone expected to be a suicide mission to infiltrate the largest Vorthak hive ship in the sector. His pilot officer Randy Cooper made an accidental discovery that changed everything when he started playing jazz music over open communication channels during the approach, causing the entire alien formation to break apart as individual ships began moving in uncoordinated patterns. The discovery that improvised music could disrupt Vorthak coordination led to the strangest military order ever issued. All human forces were instructed to play music continuously during combat operations, turning every battle into a concert that the aliens could not understand or predict. Symphony orchestras became weapons of war as effective as any missile system. Fighter pilot. Lieutenant Ben Clark found that his ship's repair drones could be reprogrammed to perform maintenance tasks on enemy vessels, approaching Vorthak bioships as if they belonged there, before beginning to disassemble vital systems. The aliens had no framework for understanding why humans would send repair equipment into battle, creating confusion that lasted long enough for conventional weapons. To find their targets, Marine Corporal Tina Brooks discovered that she could defeat alien warriors in hand-to-hand combat by constantly changing her fighting style, mixing ballet with boxing, interpretive dance with martial arts, and gymnastics with wrestling techniques. Her approach created a combat form that was impossible to predict because it followed no consistent pattern or logical progression. Davis led her converted civilian fleet in an attack on a Vorthak supply convoy, using tactics that should have resulted in her court-martial under normal circumstances. Luxury yachts attacked battleships while garbage haulers rammed into enemy formations, and passenger liners launched fighters from their cargo bays. The convoy was destroyed through sheer confusion, as the aliens tried to understand why humans used inappropriate vessels for everything. The entropy protocol was implemented across all human forces, turning every individual soldier, pilot, and support worker into a chaos generator, whose job was to be as unpredictable as possible. Decisions were made using coin flips and dice rolls. Ship courses were changed for no reason other than because it felt right, and supply officers began delivering random equipment to random locations. Miller watched from his command bunker as the Vorthak fleet arrived at Ironhold, expecting another easy conquest but finding instead a planet that operated according to no rational principles. Defenses appeared and disappeared without pattern. Civilians acted like soldiers while soldiers acted like civilians, and every building had been converted into something that served multiple contradictory purposes. Simultaneously, the siege began with aliens landing in areas that appeared undefended, only to discover that grocery stores had become ammunition depots, shopping malls had been turned into trap-filled mazes, and children's playgrounds concealed sniper positions disguised as recreational equipment. Every structure served purposes that made no sense to logical analysis, but worked perfectly in practice. Cooper's fighter squadron included luxury liner pilots, cargo ship operators, and civilian taxi drivers who had never flown in combat, but whose lack of training became an advantage. They did not know what they were supposed to do, so they improvised constantly, flying in formations that existed nowhere in military manuals, and using maneuvers that violated both physics and common sense. Hayes received reports from across the war zone confirming her theories about Vorthak vulnerability to controlled chaos. Enemy forces were retreating from battles they should have won easily, their collective consciousness overwhelmed by the sheer randomness of human behavior that grew more creative and unpredictable with each passing day. The war had become something entirely new, a conflict where creativity mattered more than firepower and imagination, proved more effective than traditional military science. The crystalline ship appeared in Earth's solar system without warning, its hull reflecting light in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Ambassador Zethka of the Kalani people stepped onto Luna Station, wearing robes that seemed to be woven from captured starlight, his ancient face carrying the weight of 3 centuries spent hiding from the Vorthak collective in pocket. Dimensions where time moved differently, Admiral. Blake met the alien ambassador in diplomatic quarters that had been hastily prepared for a species humanity had never encountered before. Zethka spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through crystal formations, explaining that his people had survived a Vorthak invasion by making themselves as small and invisible as possible, hiding their entire civilization until the danger passed. The Kalani had watched dozens of species fall to the collective consciousness over the centuries, each one choosing either complete surrender or total extinction, when faced with impossible odds against an enemy that could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means. But humanity had chosen something different, something that the Kalani had never seen before and did not understand. Instead of hiding or surrendering, humans had made themselves the loudest and most chaotic force in the galaxy, turning their own unpredictability into a weapon that somehow worked against an enemy that should have been unbeatable. The Kalani had emerged from hiding specifically to warn humanity about the World Render Weapon, a device capable of destroying entire solar systems that the Vorthak Queen Mind deployed when conventional conquest proved too difficult. Blake listened to Zethka's warning while reviewing reports. that showed human forces winning battles through methods that violated every principle of military science. The Vorthak advance had not just slowed but actually reversed in several sectors, as their collective consciousness became overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of human resistance that grew more creative with each passing day. Admiral Morrison assembled humanity's largest fleet in the asteroid fields near Sirius, gathering every spaceworthy vessel from across human territory for what everyone knew would be the final battle. Massive battleships flew alongside converted passenger liners. Military fighters shared space with civilian cargo haulers, and generation ships that normally carried colonists had been turned into mobile fortresses bristling with improvised weapons. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sandra Pierce worked frantically in medical bays throughout the fleet, treating injuries that ranged from conventional battle wounds to psychological trauma caused by fighting an enemy that seemed to break the basic rules of reality. The stress of facing extinction was pushing human minds beyond their normal limits. But instead of breaking down, people were discovering new ways to think and fight. General Miller coordinated ground defenses across 12 worlds simultaneously through a communication network that linked every human settlement in the threatened sectors. His command structure included teachers who had become tactical planners, artists who designed camouflage systems, and children whose innocent questions often revealed strategic possibilities that trained military officers had completely missed. The Vorthak Queen Mind made her final ultimatum through captured human prisoners, her voice echoing across every communication frequency in human space with mathematical certainty. Humanity had 24 hours to surrender and join the collective consciousness willingly, preserving some trace of human knowledge within the greater whole, or face complete annihilation when the world render arrived to sterilize entire star systems. Morrison's response was broadcast from every human ship and settlement, his words carrying the defiance that had kept his species alive against impossible odds for months of desperate warfare. He stood on his flagship bridge surrounded by officers who represented crews that had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. But their faces showed determination rather than fear or despair. Captain Davis led the strangest military formation in galactic history toward the Vorthak staging area, her converted civilian vessels flying in patterns that existed nowhere in any tactical manual, but somehow felt right to crews who had learned to trust instinct over logic. Luxury cruise liners deployed fighters from their entertainment decks while garbage collection ships launched missiles built from recycled materials. The final battle began when the two fleets met in empty space between star systems, humanity's chaotic collection of improvised warships facing the perfect geometric formations of the Vorthak Armada. Every human innovation from months of desperate fighting came together in a symphony of controlled chaos that the alien collective consciousness could not comprehend or counter. Effectively, fighter squadrons flew in, formations based on human emotions rather than military doctrine, their movements reflecting fear and courage, anger and hope, love and desperation in patterns that created both beauty and terror simultaneously. The pilots had learned to fly like they were dancing or painting pictures in space rather than following predetermined attack patterns that enemies could predict and counter. Colonel Johnson led Marines who used weapons that should not have worked but somehow did anyway, including explosives made from kitchen appliances and tactical programs written by poets rather than military strategists. The boarding parties that attacked Vorthak ships included professionals who had no business being in combat, but whose unique skills proved surprisingly effective against an enemy that had never encountered such diverse approaches. Commander Torres commanded a strike force that included a jazz musician whose improvisations disrupted alien communication systems, a professional chef who understood how to interfere with biological processes, and a mime artist whose silent performances somehow disabled motion sensors throughout entire Vorthak vessels. The combination should have been ridiculous but proved devastatingly effective. The battle reached its climax when Davis activated experimental chaos field generators aboard her flagship, creating zones of pure randomness where the normal laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute rules. Vorthak bioships found their organic hulls changing properties without warning while their weapons fired in directions that defied gravitational principles, and their navigation systems produced results that contradicted basic mathematics. Something unprecedented began happening across the Vorthak fleet as individual Units started acting independently, for the first time in their species' million-year history. The collective consciousness was fracturing under the stress of trying to process unlimited chaos, creating gaps in the hive mind that allowed individual thoughts and desires to emerge. In alien warriors who had never experienced personal choice before, Dr. Hayes watched from her laboratory as Vorthak specimens in containment began exhibiting individual behaviors, each one making different choices when faced with identical situations. The collective consciousness was breaking down into separate pieces as exposure to human unpredictability rewrote the fundamental programming that had controlled their species since before Earth's son was born. The Queen Mind's voice became erratic and uncertain as she struggled to maintain control over units that were learning to think for themselves, her perfect mathematical certainty cracking under questions that had no logical answers. The silence that followed the great battle was stranger and more unsettling than all the chaos that had come before it. Admiral Morrison walked through the corridors of his flagship, passing crew members who were still trying to understand what they had accomplished and what it meant for the future of both species. Victory felt different than anyone had expected, more like the beginning of something new rather than the end of something old. Reports flooded in from across human space, painting a complex picture of change that went far beyond military success. The Vorthak fleet had retreated to the edges of the galaxy, but they had not been defeated in any traditional sense of the word. Their Queen Mind was struggling to maintain control over individual units that had learned to think for themselves, creating a crisis within their collective consciousness that might take generations to resolve completely. Some Vorthak warriors had chosen to remain behind rather than return to their retreating fleet, requesting asylum in human space so they could continue learning about the strange concept of individual existence. These former enemies spoke in broken words about emotions they were experiencing for the first time, describing feelings they had no names for but which humans recognized as curiosity, wonder, and something that might have been hope. Dr. Hayes worked around the clock in research facilities that had been hastily converted from military medical bays, studying the Vorthak, who had abandoned their collective consciousness to experience independent thought. The process was irreversible according to her research, meaning that exposure to human chaos had permanently altered their brain structure in ways that made it impossible to return to the hive mind even if they wanted to. The cost of victory became painfully clear as damage reports arrived from settlements throughout human territory. Entire colonies had been destroyed during the war, their populations scattered to the void or absorbed into the Vorthak collective before individual consciousness had begun spreading through the alien ranks. Millions of humans were dead or missing, and the economic infrastructure that had supported interstellar civilization lay in ruins across dozens of star systems. But something remarkable had emerged from the destruction, something that made the enormous sacrifice worthwhile, even as it broke the hearts of those who counted the final cost. Humanity had discovered that chaos and creativity were not just survival tools but the foundation for building a completely new kind of civilization, one that embraced unpredictability as a way of life rather than something to be controlled or eliminated. Admiral Blake stood in the rebuilt command center of Luna Station watching as exploration ships prepared to launch toward distant stars, their crews including former enemies who had chosen freedom over unity. These vessels carried teams that mixed artists with scientists, philosophers with engineers, and dreamers whose job was to imagine possibilities that pure logic could never conceive or understand. The Kalani ambassador Zethka had remained on Luna Station to study human society, fascinated by a species that had survived by becoming impossible to ignore, rather than learning to hide effectively. His people had endured by making themselves as small and invisible as possible, but humans had chosen the opposite approach, making themselves so chaotic and unpredictable that even gods of war could not understand them well enough to achieve victory. General Miller established new training protocols, based on lessons learned during the war, revolutionizing military education throughout human space in ways that would have been unthinkable before the conflict. Academies now taught creative destruction alongside traditional tactics, encouraging officers to think like artists and poets, as much as strategists and soldiers when facing unknown challenges. The most successful commanders were those who could embrace controlled chaos while maintaining enough organizational structure to accomplish their objectives. Military doctrine was rewritten to include sections on productive randomness, beneficial confusion, and the strategic advantages of making decisions that appeared to make no sense but somehow worked perfectly in practice. Dr. Sandra Pierce published her comprehensive report on the psychological effects of the war, documenting how contact with the Vorthak collective consciousness had fundamentally changed human thinking in ways that would influence the species for centuries to come. Exposure to truly alien intelligence had forced humans to examine their own assumptions about consciousness, individuality, and the nature of intelligent life itself. Engineers throughout human space began studying what they called productive chaos theory, learning to design systems that functioned better when they included random elements rather than depending entirely on perfect predictability. Cities were rebuilt with layouts that made no logical sense but somehow felt more alive and vibrant than traditional urban planning could ever achieve. Captain Davis found herself commanding not a military fleet but an exploration force tasked with making contact with species that had been hiding from the Vorthak for centuries or millennia. Her ships carried diplomats who had learned to negotiate using controlled unpredictability, creating agreements that were flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, while remaining stable enough to build lasting trust. The former Vorthak who had chosen individual consciousness formed communities throughout human space, learning to live as separate beings while maintaining loose connections with others of their kind. They brought knowledge of advanced biotechnology and organic engineering techniques, but more importantly, they brought entirely new perspectives on what it meant to be alive and thinking and capable of making independent choices. Morrison received regular reports from frontier regions where human exploration teams were making contact with civilizations that had spent centuries hiding from the collective consciousness. These species emerged from their hiding places to find a galaxy where chaos had become a weapon and individuality had become a strength. Concepts that offered hope for rebuilding everything the Vorthak had destroyed during their expansion. Children throughout human space learned to play games with no predetermined rules, solve problems that had no correct solutions, and dream dreams that made no logical sense but somehow felt more real than anything that followed rational patterns. Teachers asked their students questions that had no right answers, encouraging them to think in ways that would have been considered dangerous before the war. The Vorthak Queen Mind sent occasional messages from the edge of the galaxy, transmitted through the few units that remained connected to what was left of the collective consciousness. Her tone had changed from mathematical certainty to something that almost sounded like confusion, as if she was asking questions rather than making absolute statements for the first time in her species' existence. Pierce established new medical protocols for treating psychological conditions that had never existed before the war, helping humans and former Vorthak alike adapt to a universe where individuality was valued over conformity and creativity was considered more important than efficiency. Mental health professionals learned to encourage controlled chaos in their patients, rather than trying to eliminate all sources of unpredictability from their lives. The galaxy had become a more chaotic place, but also a more alive one, filled with possibilities that perfect order could never have created or sustained. In the end, humanity had been vastly outnumbered, but they had fought like gods of war and won something more valuable than victory. They had won the right to remain wonderfully and impossibly human in a universe that would never